in the 13th century, a rabbi who went by the name Yosef HaMekaneh, or Joseph the Official, met a priest while walking on the road to Paris. And as rabbis and priests sometimes do, the two men struck up a conversation about the Bible, and specifically about Jacob. The priest said to the rabbi, "There is no greater thief, no greater extractor of usury in history than Jacob. For one plate of lentils, one plate, which was worth half a coin, Jacob tricked his brother and acquired the birthright, which was worth 1,000 coins." If you don't recall the story that priest was referencing, it's an incident which we read in this morning's Torah portion. When Esau, Isaac and Rebekah's older son, comes in from the field, exhausted and famished, he sees Jacob, his younger brother, cooking a pot of lentil stew. And Esau says to Jacob, "Give me some of that red stew to gulp down. Ki ayef anochi, for I am exhausted. I'm famished. I'm on the brink of collapse." And Jacob very slyly says, "No problem. I'd be happy to give you the lentil stew in exchange for the birthright status. If I give you this pot of lentil stew, then I will take on the status of the firstborn son." And Esau, who's in a state of complete and utter exhaustion and who is in no condition to argue with his brother, agrees. And later, Jacob tricks his blind father Isaac into giving him, and not Esau, the birthright blessing. Jacob, one of the great venerated ancestors of the Jewish people, is a trickster. He's a cheat. He is a master of manipulation and deception. According to both the Jewish and Christian traditions, Jacob was the ancestor of Israel, of Judaism, and Esau was the ancestor of Rome and ultimately of Christianity. For hundreds of years, in the collective Christian consciousness, Jews have been labeled as swindlers, as cheats, as charlatans, due in no small measure to the story of Jacob and Esau that we read this morning. When that priest in medieval France condemned Jacob, really he was condemning all Jewish people. He was accusing all of us of being usurers and tricksters and thieves. When people ask where anti-Semitism came from and why Jews have been so deeply hated for thousands of years, it is not unreasonable to say that the story of Jacob's deception of both his brother and his father, the story that we read this morning, is one of the wellsprings. It's one of the foundational stories from which anti-Semitism originated. Since October 7th, we have seen an explosion of anti-Semitism in this country. As Jake mentioned, rates of anti-Semitism have risen 400%. 400% since the war with Hamas began. These kinds of rates of anti-Semitism is something we haven't seen since Germany in the 1930s and the 1940s. And that's not being hyperbolic, that is not being alarmist, that's a fact. And when people say that their criticism of Israel or their resentment towards Jews who support Israel is attributable to Israel's actions in Gaza over the past month, you can remind them of that priest in the 13th century who cited this morning's Torah portion in his peripatetic debates with that rabbi. You can remind them that when people spew hatred towards Jews, they are tapping into the world's most ancient form of hatred. A form of hatred that can trace its origins back thousands of years, all the way back to the book of Genesis, to the story of Jacob and Esau. The world doesn't hate us because of the modern state of Israel. The world doesn't hate us because of the way Israel treats Palestinians. The world hates us because we're Jews. Plain and simple, full stop. And the world has always hated us for no other reason than the fact that we are Jews. That's been true from the very beginning. The first recorded reference to the people of Israel in a non-biblical source comes from something called the Merentah stele, a hieroglyphic inscription which dates back to the 13th century BCE, over 3,000 years ago. I've actually seen it. You can see it today. It's on display at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And you know what that ancient Egyptian inscription says, that 3,000-year-old inscription? It says, Israel has been laid waste, its seed is no more. The very first reference to Jews in a non-Jewish source in history, an inscription that is over 3,000 years old, discusses the destruction and the annihilation of the Jewish people. They tried to kill us, we won, let's eat is the world's oldest Jewish joke for a reason, because it really does tell us the story of our people. In 1903, Rabbi Solomon Schechter delivered a speech in which he coined the phrases lower anti-Semitism and higher anti-Semitism. Acts of lower anti-Semitism are physical acts of violence perpetrated against Jews. The Chelmnitsky massacre, the Kishinev pogrom, the killing of 11 Jews at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, the horrific, unthinkable attack of October 7th. But higher anti-Semitism, that's something else entirely. It's an elevated, more intellectual form of anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism of the academic and political realms. Ivy League institutions erecting barriers to limit their number of Jewish students 100 years ago. And today, at Cornell University, Professor Russell Rickford calling Hamas's attack on October 7th exhilarating. Or at Columbia University, my alma mater, Professor Joseph Massad calling the events of October 7th awesome, astounding, an incredible victory. And of course, at universities all over the world, students reciting the genocidal chant, from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free. It's difficult enough to deal with one form of anti-Semitism, but right now, we're dealing with both. Higher anti-Semitism at our most prestigious institutions of higher learning, and lower anti-Semitism not only through the brutal attack of October 7th, but also through the tragic death of Paul Kessler, the 69-year-old man who was killed while rallying on behalf of Israel in Southern California just last week. And Paul Kessler's death represents the convergence of these two terrible forms of anti-Semitism, because the man being charged with his death is a college professor. Higher anti-Semitism leads to lower anti-Semitism. Ideas have power. Intellectual hatred leads to physical violence. As Heinrich Heine famously put it, those who burn books will, in the end, burn people. But despite the fear, despite the anxiety, despite the looming sense of dread that has been constantly with us since October 7th, this past week, was really one of the most energizing and invigorating weeks in the history of American Judaism. On Tuesday, I was honored to stand in unity with nearly 300,000 Jews at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. We were there to voice our full-throated support of Israel, to plead for the return of the 240 hostages, and to cry out against the insidious and precipitous rise of anti-Semitism in this country. I am so proud that we had a full bus of 43 people from Temple Beth Shalom, including 10 public school students who missed a day of school to use their voices and speak out on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people. At the march on Tuesday, we heard from students, we heard from politicians, we heard from parents of hostages who are being held captive in Gaza. But even more impressive than the speakers themselves was the fact that we stood in a sea of hundreds of thousands of Jewish people who were all there for the same reason, because they love and support Israel, and because they are profoundly concerned about what is happening in this country. The great French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre once wrote that anti-Semitism defines the Jew. More than anything else, Sartre said, hatred for the Jewish people has kept the Jewish people together. And I, for one, have never wanted to believe that he was right. I want to believe that Jews are defined by our religious, our literary, our cultural, and our moral contributions to civilization, not that we are defined by those who seek to destroy us, those who seek to wipe us out. But this week, as painful and difficult as it is for me to admit, I think Sartre may have been proven right. On the bus ride home from Washington, I led our group in a very special bracha, a special blessing, which is only recited when you are a part of a group of 600,000 Jews, the same as the number of Jews who stood at the foot of Sinai at the moment of revelation. We didn't quite hit 600,000 on Tuesday, but there were about 300,000 people in Washington in person and 250,000 people watching the rally via live stream. So really, we actually came pretty close. And it was a very powerful, once-in-a-lifetime moment for me to be able to lead a group from my synagogue in that special bracha, that special blessing called Chacham HaRazim, a blessing which is recited only when one is part of a sea of Jewish people, as we were on Tuesday. And I think the fact that nearly 600,000 people came together for the rally, both in person and virtually, proves Sartre right. Maybe anti-Semitism does define us, at least in this moment. I can't think of anything else that has the power to mobilize and galvanize and unify nearly 600,000 Jews. The swell of unity and solidarity, resilience and Jewish pride we have experienced over the past month, which culminated in Washington on Tuesday, has exceeded all of our wildest expectations. The Jewish world is as engaged, as connected, as unified as it has been in decades, and frankly, maybe ever. And I'm deeply sorry that it took October 7th and all of the hatred that has arisen in the wake of October 7th to get us to this point. But we're here, and I'm glad we're here, because we're unified. We are resilient. We are as strong as we have ever been. That ancient inscription on the Marantas Stele, the inscription which proclaims that our people had been laid waste, that our seed is no more, it was wrong. It was wrong 3,300 years ago, and it continues to be wrong today, because despite Egypt, despite Rome, despite Nazi Germany, and yes, despite Hamas, we are still here. Tuesday, the day of the rally, was also Rosh Chodesh Kislev, the first day of the month of Kislev, the month during which we celebrate Hanukkah. On Hanukkah, we not only light the candles, but we have an obligation to publicly display the candles. The core mitzvah of Hanukkah is called Pirsumei Nisa, the mitzvah to publicize the miracle, and that's why we place our Chanukiot in our windows, to convey to the world that no matter how hard our enemies have tried to oppress us and extinguish us, our light will continue to shine beautifully and brilliantly. The light of the Jewish people will never go out. And what we did on Tuesday was the greatest act of Pirsumei Nisa that I can possibly imagine. On Tuesday, we publicized the miracle of Jewish strength, the miracle of Jewish unity, the miracle of Jewish resilience to the entire world. Despite the fact that in every generation our enemies have risen up to destroy us, in Washington, we publicized the miraculous fact that in every generation, they have failed. And they will always fail. Because as both the Hanukkah candles and the hundreds of thousands of Jews in Washington remind us, light and hope will always triumph over darkness and hatred. Shabbat Shalom and Am Yisrael Chai. Amen. We turn to Chatzi Kaddish on page